that we can tell the story of the last decade as having this double quality. On the one hand, the weaknesses in the legal political system and how they interact have created a perfect storm for the rise and return of a figure like Trump that is defecting basically from broadly democratic principles. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean one should just abandon constitutionalism. The impeachment process in the Constitution is essentially broken, can't be used. The purpose that gives the U.S. Meaning, both internationally and domestically, isn't as present. I think we can move toward thinking about, D.C. should be a state, reforms to the Senate. There's a whole range of potential reforms, reforms to the courts. So I would support term limits for the Supreme Court.
Today on Untangling Podcast, I'm thrilled to welcome Aziz Rana, a government and law professor at Boston College and a leading scholar who critically examines the weaknesses in American Constitution. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me on the show. It's great to be here.
To get started, I just wanted to ask you, why do you do the work that you do?
Well, I think I'm somebody that's generally interested in American history, American ideas, the American experience. So it's the country that I'm a part of. And as a result, it's something that I've wanted to explore. And at the same time, I have strong values and commitments about how I imagine the world should be. And so teaching and studying law feels like a great way to intersect those two different elements, both the scholarly and the dimensions of it that are really tied to what I feel like is most important about the kind of world that we should have.
Mm-hmm. You often talk about the weaknesses in our Constitution and how that evolved during the 20th century. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about that and how it ties into the modern day reality?
Sure. So one of the things that's interesting about growing up in the U.S., especially, let's say, at the end of the last century, the beginning of this one, is that if you spent time in schools or just listened to political speeches, the framing of the U.S. Constitution was as a near ideal distillation of what representative government could be. And there was an overarching story about how the Constitution fit within American values and principles. And so the Constitution fulfilled the principles of the Declaration of Independence. It stood for the idea of equality and equal liberty for all. It was strongly connected to notions of civil liberties. So it established a range of rights like free speech or free exercise, religious freedoms that are supposed to be distinct from the kinds of pressures that government actors could bring to bear. It was tied to a defense of property rights and the market, but nonetheless contained by a regulatory state that ensured basic social welfare provisions, but also kept at bay some of the worst forms of depredation that unchecked markets could impose, private power, private economic power. And all of that was tied to an account of checks and balances with a strong court that was supposed to preserve rights and maintain the system. And each of these different elements linked together to explain why, the U.S. was understood as an exceptional country, as historically distinct, as creating this near ideal distillation of political institutions and liberal principles, and why the U.S., therefore, on the global stage, rightly enjoyed a kind of primacy or power to pursue its interests because its interests were really understood as the world's interests. So this was an overarching way of thinking about American life. And yet at the same time, there was this sort of underlying reality, which is that America's electoral system is really notable for the extent to which, even though we think of the country as democratic, it's not actually organized on the principle of one person, one vote. That really the central unit of representation is not the individual voter, but it's a geographical unit, and it's the unit of the state. And the role of state-based representation across the entire legal and political system has had really profound and deleterious consequences. So it allows, for instance, states to play a central role in gerrymandering districts within the House of Representatives, so that even though the House of Representatives is supposed to be representative of citizens generally and so organized around the principle of one person, one vote, that's not necessarily the case with how the districts are set up. You see it with the Senate and the dramatic overrepresentation of small population centers. You see it with the Electoral College and the steady election of folks to the presidency that might have lost the popular vote. So twice in recent years, in 2000 and 2016. And then we see it in the composition of the Supreme Court, so that federal judges serve for life with good behavior. The Supreme Court, through norms that have emerged, is incredibly small, just 9 justices. And it's nominated by a president that may have lost the popular vote, confirmed by a Senate whose population distributions may be wildly out of touch with the rest of the country's demographic, cultural, as well as just political sensibilities. And all of this creates a set of what we can think of as pretty profound dysfunctions in our political process. And that creates this divergence between a venerative culture that's preceded about the genius of American institutions and an underlying political reality in which those very same institutions have ended up intensifying what I would view as pretty negative incentives when it comes to how our politicians behave, as well as just pathologies in the operation of our legal and political systems.
Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate a little bit more of how exactly that makes our system weak? Because I think about Electoral College, some people like that because there's no domination of cities over the entirety of the country, and even these like small geographies have a vote in this situation. I'm personally not necessarily a fan of Electoral College, but I just know that there are supporters there. What is the direct effect, I guess, of that? In terms of making our system weaker?
So 2 thoughts. One thought about checks and balances in a constitutional order, and one sort of effort to kind of concretize the problematic consequences of our constitutional system. So on checks and balances, my own view is that if you're committed to the principles of little c constitutionalism and constitutional democracy, it's essential to be able to have a system that both expresses popular sentiment, but at the same time has the capacity to protect communities that are most marginalized and that, are minority communities within the society. So to ward off problems of both minority rule, so empowered elite, economic and racial elites using their various kinds of cultural and material resources to impose forms of subordination, but also ward off real problems of majority tyranny and majority rule, where you have marginalized communities that are not able to have their voices heard. The thing about the U.S. system is it's not that it's just any framework of checks and balances. It's a framework of checks and balances built especially on geography. And so if you were to just take a step back and think, well, what are the minority constituencies that we should have a system that dramatically overrepresents because there's a history of discrimination or injustice imposed on it? You wouldn't think, well, it's small population centers in predominantly rural states. And yet we have a system where the structure of checks and balances is built on dramatically overrepresenting political voice and power in places that are small population centers. And you could even say, well, in a country that's as diverse and plural as the U.S., we want to ensure that rural communities have their voices heard and are not just swamped by the power of large cities. But that doesn't mean that you'd have an entire electoral infrastructure that's built on preserving their power to the exclusion of lots of other types of diversity. So you could imagine many different ways of organizing checks and balances that would elevate the voice of different types of minority populations, but that's not the system that we have. And so in a way, the problem is not the theory of checks and balances, which I would say is one that's essential to constitutionalism, but it's the mode of checks and balances that we've implemented that really undermine the capacity of historically marginalized groups to have their voices met, as well as different types of population centers to be able to be as effective in making decisions. And I think one of the ways that you can see this play out, frankly, is the rise of Trump and the return of Trump to power.
Yeah.
So we can think of it this way. Just look at the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court's nomination and confirmation process, because of the way in which it runs through the Electoral College, the presidency, and the Senate, has been wildly out of step with where majority opinion has gone. So since 1988, there have only been 2 occasions where a Republican president has won, presidential nominee has won the popular vote. And that's 2004 and most recently in 2024. And yet during this very period, the Republican Party, because of the benefits of the Electoral College and the structure of the Senate, where we're moving increasingly to a world in which, 70% of the population is only in 15 of the states, has been able to dramatically transform the nature of the court. Since 1968, Democratic presidents have only been able to nominate and get confirmed to the Supreme Court 5 justices. Trump alone, despite losing the popular vote in 2016, was able to nominate and get confirmed 3. There has not been a Democratic nominated Chief Justice of the Supreme Court since 1946, wow, which is before our contemporary party system. And how has that shifted American politics? So in 2016, you have Trump losing the popular vote and yet being elected to the presidency. Then, because of the nature of the electoral system, being able to fundamentally reshape the nature of the court. So reconstruct the court in ways that have proven, had really profound effects on massive social policy. So led, for instance, to the overturning of Roe versus Wade, even though we live in a world in which public opinion data says that somewhere between 60% and 2/3 of the public support abortion protections. So we have policies that are national policies that are not actually consistent with public sentiment. And this is especially an issue in our constitutional system because it's not just that the court serves for life, justices on the court serve for life, but scholars say that the U.S. Constitution is perhaps the hardest in the world to amend. And so all constitutional politics gets funneled into the court in ways that limit the capacity of publics to exercise constitutional voice in other domains. And so the reason why you have the courts, for instance, establishing something like a constitutional protection for abortion or same-sex marriage is precisely because you can't change the formal document. And yet, if because of the vagaries of the electoral system, you have a court that's composed of figures whose views are wildly out of step with public sentiment, it produces a real inversion of what the constitutional order should look like. So there's that issue. But then all of the ways in which the country is marked, not really by checks and balances, but profound blockages in the effective functioning of its institutions, is why once Trump then essentially refuses to leave office in 2020 and attempts to overthrow a democratic election, it's incredibly hard to hold him accountable. The impeachment process in the Constitution is essentially broken, can't be used, again, in part because of the focus on state-based representation. And then beyond that, it's very difficult to hold him criminally accountable. And that's made even harder by the Supreme Court, which issues opinions like Trump versus U.S., which provide broad forms of immunity for presidential action in a way that actually just create a culture of impunity around activities that are real violations of democratic practice and the rule of law. And then on top of that, unlike what we see in other countries around the world, it's very difficult to remove Trump from running for future elections after attempting to overturn a past one. So something that we've seen kind of commonplace is that if you have presidents engage in these kinds of practices, there might be limitations on their ability to stand for office. This is the story, for instance, in Brazil with Bolsonaro. But that's also not something that's available as a means within our constitutional system. And all of this then creates a context where Trump is able to persist as a really significant political figure. The difficulties of the constitutional system also make it very, very hard for when Biden is president or you have a Democrat in office to be able to engage in effective governance and respond to the issues of the day, because it's virtually impossible to get significant legislation, even if it has broad support, passed through Congress. That creates a general atmosphere of, real paralysis and disaffection with the political process, which goes hand in hand with a global environment of anti-incumbency. And it then allows even somebody like Trump to win, a bare victory in the popular vote. It should be noted, Trump still didn't get to 50%. It was an incredibly close victory. It's hardly a popular mandate. But both the atmosphere of impunity that's sustained by the constitutional system and the forms of paralysis it imposes on the ability of parties and majority coalitions to actually implement policy create a perfect storm to have somebody like him come back to power. And then, of course, he comes back to power in a setting in which he has limited commitment to democratic principles. And in fact, he's part of a coalition now that sees multiracial democracy as an almost existential threat. And so unsurprisingly, he's organized politics really around targeting political enemies, enriching allies, and strengthening the folks around him that are most loyal. And these are oftentimes individuals that have extreme ideological positions that are pretty wildly out of step with where the public is. So this is to say that we can tell the story of the last decade as having this double quality. On the one hand, the weaknesses in the legal political system and how they interact have created a perfect storm for the rise and return of a figure like Trump that is defecting basically from broadly democratic principles. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean one should just abandon constitutionalism. One has to recognize that this constitutional system, as flawed as it is, also has embedded within it little c principles of constitutional democracy, the rule of law, especially checks and constraints on unlimited forms of executive power, that need to be protected, even as we have forthright conversations about the importance of producing pretty profound structural changes to our system as a whole. We need to both defend the principle of constitutionalism and be committed in thinking in a forward-looking manner to constitutional reform and renewal.
Mm-hmm. Something that I just thought of is I feel like partially why it's so difficult to push any change in our system right now is such radicalization of politics on the right and on the left. I feel like bipartisanship almost no longer exists. How much is it, I guess, a structural or a constitutional problem? How much of it was, I guess, the fault of how the Constitution was written? Or is it just a sort of part of the natural process of how political systems develop, because we don't just see that in the US, we see it in a lot of places in the world.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to look at the interactive effects of the institutions and then also the background culture. So the thing that I would say is that when I grew up in the US, the thought was part of what makes this system so ideal was that it was supposed to economize on virtue. In other words, the language out of the Federalist Papers that sort of defended the Constitution during the ratification process in the 1780s was that it produced a system that didn't require a society of angels, that you could ensure that the self-interest of political actors counteracted each other through this intricate arrangement. But that's actually not the story of why the mid-century compact that I described at the beginning worked. It was a function of two things. The first was, in the 1930s, in the context of the Great Depression, there was massive labor organizing, really powerful unions that produced huge supermajorities for the Democratic Party and for FDR. And that these supermajorities were the condition by which FDR was able to pursue New Deal legislation. Many of the landmark bills that Americans view now as so sort of central to collective life, things like the Social Security Act. It was overcoming those various roadblocks and constraints through huge amounts of supermajority support that really is historically quite unusual. You don't have clear parallels either before or after. And so that provided the foundation for the modern administrative state. And then the second thing that was really key and was part of the move toward, let's say, racial inclusion, the overcoming of Jim Crow, was that the U.S. found itself in a fight for global power after World War II with the Soviet Union, an ideological antagonist, at a time in which American elites, especially national party elites, particularly in the North, but not exclusively, were attempting to win hearts and minds of folks in the global South, so folks in Africa and Asia and Latin America that had recently been colonized. And what the Cold War, this Cold War circumstance did, is it suppressed partisan conflict. It pushed folks in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party sort of toward the center. When we think about the Cold War and the way that this suppression worked, we tend to think especially about McCarthyism and the repression of folks on the left, so socialists, activists of various sorts. But this climate also led many people that were on the right, especially in the Republican Party, to increasingly disavow their extreme wing as well. So that, in a way, the depolarized climate of the mid-20th century operated on both sides to produce a kind of centrist frame for American politics. Now, there are things that you can defend about it. There are problems with the way that this played out. There's, we can have a conversation about the strengths and weaknesses of this compact. But the main thing that's worth noting is that the reason why it felt like the system was working at various points in the latter part of the 20th century was not because of the internal institutional devices. It was not like the Senate that's solving the problems, or the court, or the fact that you have geography-based representation. It was background social cohesion. Mm-hmm. So mass popular buy-in because of the achievements of the New Deal and of the Civil Rights Movement, so the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, Medicare, Social Security, collective bargaining, this produces mass popular buy-in. And then elite cohesion because of the needs of the Cold War to kind of suppress their more radical wings. And so that you can have Democrats and Republicans come together despite all of the forms of paralysis in the political system to pass big and significant laws. Mm-hmm. And then essentially what I would say that's happened over the last half century is that there's been a conservative attack on labor, which has undermined the union and labor's ability to serve some of these large mobilizing functions that it played in the early part of the 20th century. And then especially, in a way perhaps counterintuitively, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union increasingly produced a type of defection on the right from the compact. And that defection has created conditions of intense forms of political polarization, where what you no longer have in the U.S. is the type of elite social cohesion that made the whole system work. And what I would say is that if we just look globally, the story since the financial crisis has generally been, in Europe, in the U.S., a breakdown in faith in the different versions of the mid-century compact that the U.S. had one example of. So a breakdown in faith in what's called like neoliberal economic policies, the potential of the market, rising forms of xenophobia and nativism. And this has been a particularly conducive environment for the far right and a populist far right, especially because of the weaknesses of the institutions of the left, especially labor, not just in the U.S., everywhere. But it's played out differently in different locations. And one of the ways that it's played out in the States is that precisely because our institutions are not particularly good checks or safeguards against the capacity of the far right to assert power even if they don't have majority support, we've had this double quality of very little elite social cohesion intense far-right defection, but a system that dramatically overrepresents the voice and power of the far-right, so that the system is actually intensifying the problems of like the breakdown of social cohesion rather than limiting it or constraining it as we've seen in some other locations.
So it's almost like a lack of some big real threat that was during the Cold War started creating this polarization, sort of like a lack of a main problem to fight against.
So part of it is the lack of the threat, but it's really important to appreciate how that experience from, let's say, broadly speaking, the 40s to the 70s really fundamentally transformed the self-consciousness and the sense of collective identity among a wide swath of Americans, both the public and political elites. Because World War II, especially the confrontation with Nazi Germany, was understood as a war to, on behalf of principles of anti-racism, on behalf of like liberal inclusive principles, the backdrop of the Holocaust. And then the confrontation with the Soviet Union also was very much understood as part of a story of fulfilling specific kinds of egalitarian principles in the States. It went hand in hand with the politics around the civil rights movement, so that you had national elites, white and black, by the time you get to the end of the 20th century. You can think of both McCain and Obama, that really understand the story of the country in a particular kind of romantic image that links together all of those different ideological elements that I described at the beginning that don't necessarily have to go together. Like believing that the Constitution fulfills the Declaration of Independence doesn't necessarily mean that you would support a system of checks and balances or the market or American global power, but it all fit together because it was something that people had understood themselves as fighting for, as suffering for, as giving their own world's meaning. And so the collapse of the Soviet Union does a few things. First, even though this was a substantial part of the national population, and even today I'd say the largest plurality in American life backs this compact still. It's probably the biggest portion of the electorate. There had always been some portion that supported a version of what we can think of as ethno-nationalism in this country. And so that was always there, and it's able to kind of be revived because the pressure to suppress it is removed. And then on top of it, there's a sense that the kinds of the sort of the purpose that gives the U.S. Meaning, both internationally and domestically, isn't as present. So it's not just that there's no explicit threat, but there's an uncertainty about like what's supposed to galvanize national politics. Like what's the thing that brings people together? What's the purpose of American power overseas? Why do you have something like the USAID? So USAID was founded in 1961 as a Cold War institution whose function was by spreading material prosperity, especially in the global South, to show that the U.S. was committed to the well-being of all in the context of a confrontation with the Soviet Union. But all of these institutions start to become unmoored. There's a lack of clarity about to what extent the U.S. should remain bound by a rules-based order. And this is playing out both domestically and internationally in a setting in which the political institutions within the U.S. are either marked by paralysis, so they can't solve problems, or they're dramatically overrepresenting the voice of figures on the far right that have defected from the compact. And all of that together, I think, creates sort of this perfect storm.
Do you feel like after the Cold War, United States lost its sort of national purpose?
So it's a really interesting, point and thought, which is the 90s is notable for the extent to which, on the one hand, there's this climate of profound self-congratulation about the fall of the Soviet Union as proving that the only model was the American model, economically, constitutionally, and that unipolarity becomes closely associated with the idea that, American power no longer has any ideological component. It's just on behalf of abstracted human rights or like the basic principles or interests that folks everywhere might have. And so you have the rise of a language of humanitarianism. So this is all true, but at the same time, there's a real searching during this period where there's social scientists that are talking about the world maybe being marked by the end of history and sort of lamenting that, where it's like, is there still something worth fighting for that can galvanize people? You have politicians, whether it's Bush Sr. talking about 1,000 points of light, ways to create civic commitment around values, or Clinton attempting to establish things like AmeriCorps, where it's an effort to kind of galvanize civic commitment and engagement. And so there's this real uncertainty about what the future will hold. And then I think one way to think of the last 30 years, broadly speaking, have been efforts at various moments in time to effectively recharge or reinvest a sense of purpose tied to the mid-century project around what might be new enemies or new confrontations. The first obvious example is following 9/11, the war on terror in the Bush administration, where you're confronting an axis of evil and just thinking about that language. Evil is evil empire of the Soviet Union from the Reagan period. Axis is the enemies, Nazi Germany, Japan, Italy during World War II. And so you use even the Department of Homeland Security is a product of this era, and just that name is an invocation of the politics of the mid-20th century, World War II, early Cold War, the way talking about the homeland, talking about security in this way. And so we can think of the war on terror as an effort to kind of revive faith in the project, but then ended up having its own, real problems, like that it produced, if anything, a profound crisis in the legitimacy of the national security establishment. Precisely because of the ways in which we saw endless wars fought on false premises. And then you have another effort to reboot it in a way with the Obama presidency, where all of Obama's language was really an effort to connect his personal biography and the fact that he was going to became the first Black American president to the story of the nation as a kind of fulfillment of all of the commitments that are embodied by that compact. And at the same time, though, the long after effects of the financial crisis, the growing defection of the right from this compact, the emergence of a celebrity in Trump whose claim to fame is questioning whether or not Obama was born in the U.S., like all of this highlights the inability to effectively put the genie back in the bottle. And then, I think you can see every additional iteration as along these lines, not just Trump's election, but COVID. COVID is a moment initially of potential sort of national unity that then has this long afterlife in sort of breaking down faith in social science, sort of intensifying certain kinds of developments that we're seeing on the right, producing a cultural climate of more intense forms of isolation. So this is to say, there's been a long trend and process in which the last 30 years has been a kind of country in search of social cohesion against the backdrop of not just the end of the Cold War, but political institutions that are notably really ineffective at being able to manage pluralism and disagreement.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about the definition of the executive power and how it has evolved, especially, I guess, tying how the Nixon era has really reshaped. I guess the Nixon era really brought to light the weaknesses in the institution, and now we're sort of circled back to re-exploring them again. However, the public reaction seems to be much more limited than it was back in the day with the Nixon scandal.
Yeah, so I think there are many ways to narrate the rise of presidential power. So one thing is to say that what happens in the first half of the 20th century is that there's this recognition that the political institutions are not particularly democratic and that they're also not effective as a way of just implementing social policy that publics want. And rather than formally rewriting the text of the Constitution, what ends up happening in the US, and there are a series of presidents that play a central role in this, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and especially FDR, is that the country more or less grafts a powerful president, presidential administration, presidential government onto the existing constitutional system that had its, has its sort of antecedents in the 18th century. And so you end up developing a much stronger relationship between the president and the public as an embodiment of the people's will. And then you also develop this new regulatory apparatus, so an administrative state that also sort of adapted onto the constitutional system that has this interesting tension with the president. So it's housed primarily in the executive, and yet the idea of the administrative state is that on the one hand, it's an expression of the energy and efficiency that presidential power can sort of pursue to serve various types of social problems, but it's also supposed to be somewhat independent from the president, because you want to have agencies that are not just responsive to presidential dictate, so that presidents, even if this new administrative apparatus is almost a function of presidential government as a solution to the problems of the constitutional system, but you don't want presidents to be able to just use the administrative state to target enemies and then to enrich friends. And so you want some degree of independence. You want internal meritocracy and norms that separate the civil service as almost its own separate branch. So this is an extended set of political developments in the first half of the 20th century that are worth noting. And then something else that's also percolating, but that really gets entrenched at the end of World War II and during the early Cold War, is the rise of a new national security apparatus also in the executive branch, which is, to the extent that the U.S. is going to be a global superpower, is going to be engaged in a sort of asserting authority everywhere based on a theory of international police power where it sort of has a right to intervene and reconstruct the internal relations of other countries, fighting both hot wars and cold wars. There's this idea that, well, you need now a permanent, even peacetime security and military infrastructure. And so you have the passage of the National Security Act in 1947, the establishment of this CIA formally in 1949, the development of this not entirely new, but quite distinctive security apparatus with the Defense Department, like all of these different positions that are now being organized. And this produces a kind of centralized authority around decision-making and national security that's built through the executive, that is not particularly transparent with respect to the other institutions of government, let alone the public at large, and that gives the president, as the focal point of foreign policy and national security, a huge amount of discretion. What happens over the course of the second half of the 20th century is that at the same time as you see the rise of this administrative state writ large, the courts and other branches, and the political branches, so Congress, are kind of navigating what to do with this newly entrenched security apparatus in the president. And by and large, the approach is that the courts are going to be fairly aggressive as its own policy-making body when we're talking about affairs that are really thought of as domestic, but that presidents are going to have a great deal of discretion and leeway in matters that are understood as foreign or invoking national security. Now, there are limitations, and in a way, the Nixon presidency really brought this home. Because if you think about, like, the Watergate break-in is connected to the war in Vietnam. It's connected to student activism and general public activism against the war during this period of time. And the effects of Watergate sort of lead to these questions about how to inhibit excessive amounts of presidential authority in ways that can really compromise rights, especially domestically. And so you see an effort to create something like the War Powers Resolution that will limit the ability of presidents to engage in illegal and unilateral bombing campaigns. But then you also see the establishment of offices like special prosecutors or independent counsels that are sort of quasi-judicial but within the executive branch to limit or constrain forms of illegality and violence that presidents might engage in. I would say these reform efforts are somewhat effective, but largely fail in constraining the bipartisan continued growth of presidentialism when national security is invoked. At the same time, there is still this presumption of a kind of protective space for agencies when dealing with domestic matters, health, the environment, so that you can have agencies that are going to enjoy some degree of independence from presidential power. And then, really what started to take place, especially from the 80s to the present, was the emergence within conservative circles that the kind of unchecked or unconstrained president that's being defended in the national security context to a theory of what's called the unitary executive. And the unitary executive theory is the idea that there should be no internal checks within the executive branch on presidential power, so that the president should be able to unilaterally dismiss the heads of agencies or to be able to make determinations about the internal practice of agencies. That you have a growing kind of conservative argument that this unitary executive theory should allow presidents to really push back against even domestic agencies. And there's a lot of support for this from strong defenders of presidential power on the right, but then also from business activists who see the primary function of these agencies, going back to the New Deal, as a constraint on business, on private interest, as a kind of regulation of capitalism. And so all of that was percolating. It's winning various kinds of successes in the courts. And then what Trump has done specifically is he's basically just put his finger, and the people around him, like Russell Vogt and others, on these dynamics to argue as aggressively as possible for effectively unchecked presidential power in ways that fundamentally rewrite the nature of the executive office. So presidents can fire at will whoever is within agencies, can completely defund them in ways that violate Congress's Article I powers, can use the language of national security to then target non-citizens as well as political dissidents within the country. So taking all of the tools, both that had been part of the system and that conservatives had been pressing for in various ways, to then fundamentally rewrite the structure of executive power in a manner that I would say is as close as this country has gotten in recent decades to a truly authoritarian reading of presidential authority.
Yeah. Yeah, previously, I feel like unitary executive theory was very much some kind of far-right idea that nobody thought we'll see sort of playing out in our political climate.
Okay, one thought on this. It should be noted, it's really interesting. There are ways in which Trump has these connections to FDR. So FDR, for instance, in the 30s, was discomforted by the fact that you'd have these independent agencies that were run by folks that are opponents of the New Deal when he's trying to get past, massive legislation or pursue policies that will deal with economic crisis. And so, FDR, in his way, was a very strong defender of presidential power. And indeed, conservatives referred to him as operating like a dictator. The difference, I would say, is that FDR was also operating in a system in which he had massive rolling supermajority support for the implementation of the policies and was effectively trying to democratize a broader institutional order that made it very difficult for working class people to have their needs met. And the difference today is that in some ways, Trump is attempting similarly to improvise a fundamentally new arrangement for presidential power that's not there in the written text, but without the mass support. I mean, winning 49% of the vote in one election is not the same thing as essentially winning rolling supermajority elections. And also in a context in which there's widespread opposition to the implementation of these policies.
Yeah. I think a lot of Americans believe because American democracy has existed for so long, it's almost immune from authoritarianism. It's impossible that somebody will take control of the entire government. Myself being from Ukraine, I think, much more skeptical. What are your thoughts? Is American system immune from authoritarianism or not?
So, I just say that I would not have expected to be having this kind of a conversation, as recently as really the last couple years, honestly. But I'll give you my optimism and then note of caution, which is my optimism is that the difference again between Trump today and FDR in the past is that Trump and the people around him, loyalists that are ideologically extreme, do not actually have majority support for their policies. Even the most recent opinion data when it comes to the policies around immigration now have majorities of Americans opposed to the harsh crackdowns on immigrant rights, even majorities of independents. So they're pursuing an agenda that's very unpopular. And as long as, assuming that the country were to have more or less competitive elections, one would expect that, the other party would do quite well in a midterm, and that somebody that's trying to carry on the mantle of Trump would have a very difficult time getting elected in 2028. And so in a way, what this means is that Trump has a large enough base that is, quite clearly a powerful base to impose a type of breakdown on the existing system, but not a large enough base to reconstitute it as something new. And that means that really this is still an open question about how Americans can collectively reform our institutions. Now, the problem or the worry is, to what extent are some of the actions that the Trump folks are pursuing recognizing precisely this dilemma and attempting in new ways to limit the capacity of the country to be able to pursue free and fair elections going forward? That's some of my concern, for instance, with the executive order around requiring various kinds of documentation like driver's licenses to be able to vote. It's some of the concern about targeting firms that are associated with the Democratic Party, the firms that are likely to bring cases challenging efforts to subvert elections, potential targeting of NGOs and other kinds of civil society infrastructure. So that in a way, one of the battles or one of the issues of the next few years will be to ensure that the country can maintain a system of competitive elections so that politicians and officials that provide the inner circle can't continue to engage in destructive policies even if they don't have meaningful support.
Definitely. We talked a lot about the weaknesses in the Constitution. How do we, patch those holes or solve the issues? Do you have any suggestions of potential reform?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and my own view about it is there's a whole range of both legislative and constitutional reforms that I think would really improve our system. And so I'm happy to list some of those. And then in some ways, I think the more interesting thing is to think a little bit about how we get from here to there, especially in the context of the current political climate.
Definitely.
So, reforms that I think would be really valuable would be moving, for instance, the House of Representatives towards a multi-member setup in which you limit the something that looks more like proportional representation, so that it limits the capacity of gerrymandering to reshape the structure of voting in the House.
How would that look like?
So you can right now you have a single person that gets elected from a district in a first past the post race. And what this does is it really strengthens the position of the incumbent, and it allows the party to be able to make determinations about how it's going to structure the map. So you can have a state in which, let's say it's a 50-50 state, but the representatives that get elected, because of the combination of being able to draw the district a particular way and first past the post balloting, is that it might be overwhelmingly for one party in the House. And so you can play around with arrangements where more than one person gets elected effectively from a particular district, or you can move the vote structure to something that's more proportional, so that the folks that get elected from a state more clearly map onto the popular support for party positions across the state. And then you can also produce real limitations on the ability of parties to engage in gerrymandering. So that's one thing. But then alongside that, I think we can move toward thinking about, D.C. should be a state, reforms to the Senate. There's a whole range of potential reforms. Reforms to the courts. So I would support term limits for the Supreme Court. We can arrange these sorts of things even without having a formal constitutional amendment. By the Constitution says, for instance, that federal judges serve indefinitely with good behavior, but it doesn't specify which office. And so you could imagine people rotating on and off the Supreme Court for a period of time. You could have broader expansions to the court. So India has 34 justices on its Supreme Court. Germany has 16. So you can have all of these changes. You can somewhat simplify the amendment process so that it's easier to use the amendment as a way of addressing various kinds of constitutional problems. Broadly speaking, you can have legislative initiatives that make voting rights significantly easier, so that voter protections ensure that there's a broader range of people that have access to the vote. So all of these things, I think, are really important democracy-enhancing reforms, and none of them are really all that unusual or surprising. They're basically what folks have been talking about for a while.
Yeah.
And so the issue is less the policies to pursue and how to get there. And this is where my increasing view is that what matters the most in this moment, especially at a time of a real attack on the democratic foundations of the country, are the intermediate meaning-making institutions that organize people collectively and that can be independent sources of power to confront various types of attacks on democratic principles. And so, this is a time where things like unions, professional associations, medical associations, bar associations for lawyers, universities play a really important role as a way of both contesting the types of attacks, but also integrating people into communities in which these ideas about reform, are just sort of understood as part of the drinking water, the cultural drinking water of what people discuss. And so this is a time, I think, in which folks have to think about civil society, broadly speaking, how to protect it, how to expand it, and how to alter or make shifts to the nature of people's neighborhoods, their schools, their workplaces, that expand the ability of ordinary people to really participate in the collective life of the country, and then to see the link between, for instance, defending federal workers, or defending lawyers in the legal profession, or defending the independence of the university as tied, as like a precondition of then pursuing changes to voting or to the constitutional system, and all of these things is bound together. And I will say, and maybe this is a further note of optimism or hope, which is precisely because the project that's being pursued by Trump and those around him really don't have mass support in the way that it can be authorized and reauthorized through elections, that this creates space for activity in civil society connected to broad-ranging social changes, social policy changes that might affect even the Constitution, to, it creates space for us all collectively to come up with a kind of shared agenda about the type of country folks would want to live in.
This reform is, I guess, if these policies were implemented, it's going to be a very significant reform. How do you ensure that one party doesn't do it to their benefit? If they are reforming the Supreme Court and let's say Democrats are the majority, how do we prevent or even pass this policy where none of such violations occur?
So absolutely. So this is the problem of what's called constitutional hardball with norm breaking, which is that the U.S. is in a particular type of bind where chances are to be able to get out of the specific cycle, the kind of de-democratizing cycle it's in, there will be the need for some forms of kind of breaking from what had been the typical types of mutual forbearance that we've seen previously. So just to pass a voting rights bill, and this is something that came up during Biden's administration, you're going to need senators to abandon the filibuster, for instance.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what you don't want to have, and we're seeing some of this right now, is that Trump and those around Trump are not just violating the letter of the law, but they're also violating a whole range of norms around how political actors were supposed to behave. And so norm breaking, certain types of norm violation, can both be the condition by which you get meaningful change. And indeed, that's some of the story of the New Deal. It's a story of Reconstruction. But it can also be used to really produce profound forms of authoritarian entrenchment. So it can serve both types of ends. And that means you have to be really sort of strategically mindful about when to pursue various kinds of norm erosion. So it's all well and good to say in the abstract, we should have an expanded Supreme Court. But if there isn't really supermajority popular support behind it, if there isn't a durable majority that's come to the conclusion that you need an expanded Supreme Court in order to protect democratic principles, if it's just one party adding 2 justices and then another party adding 2 more, then that's its own really destructive cycle.
Yeah.
And it's why, in a way, whenever I think about issues of both legislative and then real constitutional reform, things like reforming the amendment process, or maybe even making profound changes to the nature of the Senate, these are things that there's certain kind of hardwired language in the text of the Constitution that might potentially limit even these types of changes. That if you're going to do that, you have to be able to have as the foundation for it the legitimacy coming from really a majority that's already been organized to pursue those principles. And it's why focusing on civil society, on meaning-making institutions, in other words, on building strength through these various types of intermediate associations that are the sites where people actually operate and live, as a way of then producing something like a broad agenda, feels like it's essential. Because in a way, the problem that we're experiencing right now is that party polarization is so intense, and we have such a substantial, even if minority bloc, of both the public and political elites that are willing to defect pretty systematically from democratic principle, that you have to really think about the conditions under which you want to push for change that requires an erosion of norms itself.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the hope is that Trump is going to create such a terrifying crisis that there's going to be that supermajority to reform the situation.
But, so this is the thing about it, which is I worry that this is that there's one sentiment that you're getting in the Democratic Party that's gotten a lot of pushback and criticism, rightly so, which is Trump is so bad that the Democrats should just sit on their hands and then they'll be back in power. And my worry about that is that unless you do the work of actually building a majority around a theory of change, of like what the world is that you want,
Yeah.
you want to inhabit, that it might be, assuming we have competitive elections, Democrats back in power, but just this same kind of toggling back and forth between the parties. So Democrats are back in power, the system is paralyzed, there's no sense of the party as being effective, it just produces yet another iteration of this cycle, and then you have yet another sort of extreme politician that has defected from democratic practice that would take the mantle from Trump, and that you just go back and forth in this potential cycle. And so this is to say, this moment is an opportunity, but it requires organizing and really clear forms of collective action. So it's an opportunity, precisely because Trump and those around him do not actually have the support to implement the changes they want if you have, again, competitive elections.
Yeah.
But it requires aggressive action in the moment. It requires, bar associations making clear that lawyers that violate their basic legal ethics by ignoring court orders or targeting other lawyers for who they represent, that there's some sanction that's imposed. It requires the use of litigation as a tool by firms and universities to really sort of effectively defend principles of the rule of law, academic freedom. It requires public galvanizing to protect those that are most marginalized. And so that's either non-citizens or, protesters in the context of the war in Gaza, or people that are transgender. So you need to have a type of galvanized public that's operating through these intermediate institutions and that's effectively participating across all of the different levers of power.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one thing I would want to see from the Democratic Party is what Trump was really effective at, is I think having a movement and having sort of a vision, but a sort of umbrella of policies that you could sell as a package. And I feel like the Democratic Party, if they could package their ideas just in a little bit more of a palatable way for the electorate, I think that would be very helpful in my opinion. I have about 100 more questions for you, but I know
So maybe one last thought on this, which is, I think this is really key, because to me, the difference between Trump and the people around Trump and the Democratic Party, sort of like its establishment to date, has been Trump and the people around Trump don't take as given that there's a median voter that has like certain fixed views and you're just trying to find what that median voter might think. They operate like a movement that's attempting to shift the culture of the society by altering the nature of the institutions and the world that they inhabit. And this is why there's such an aggressive attack on workers and unions and universities and firms and all of these other elements. And to date, the mainstream of the Democratic Party has operated in some ways like it's still like 1995 or maybe 1975, rather than essentially doing the same kind of world-building work, which is how do you create a movement culture through changes to the nature of our institutions that can effectively counter what we're seeing from the far right.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. One last question for you. If you could pass one reform, change one law, what would it be?
So, I think right now we need to really make pretty significant changes to voting rights. So that would probably be the one that I would focus on.
Thank you once again, Aziz. This was very interesting.
My pleasure. Thanks.